Chapter 51 Paris Angel Company goes public. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In 1717, John Law, a financial whiz of his time, launched the Mississippi Company to tackle France's massive debt. He snagged exclusive rights to run the Louisiana colony from the French government, and then the company started selling shares. Rumor had it that the Mississippi River basin was loaded with gold, and the company kept getting the go-ahead to manage more French colonies overseas, so the stock price went through the roof. It jumped from 500 livres a share at the start to nearly 20,000 livres at its peak. Yep, that's 40 times the original price. Law saw this as his chance to wipe out France's $1.5 billion national debt. Starting in 1719, he issued more stock 5 times in a row, cashing in on the skyrocketing prices and working with the Royal Bank to print money. And guess what? He actually paid off the French government's debt. Of course, he didn't rake in 1.5 billion livres in just 3 years through legitimate means. It was all built on a stock market bubble. By 1720, the Mississippi gold mine myth started to crumble when hordes of prospectors came up empty-handed. The Mississippi Company's stock price nosedived, and people panicked, selling off their shares like crazy, driving the price below 200 livres. The French regent at the time, the Duke of Orleans, quickly yanked back all the Mississippi Company's special privileges. The company went belly up, and billions of livres vanished overnight, an amount equal to over 30 years of France's total tax revenue back then. Countless investors who bought Mississippi Company stock went broke, and France plunged into a severe economic crisis. Commerce and industry ground to a halt, leaving only agriculture standing. This mess paved the way for the rise of the French physiocrats. Law skipped town, leaving a disaster zone behind him, and France didn't recover for decades. Around the same time, Britain had its own similar disaster, the South Sea Bubble. The British government quickly passed the Bubble Act to put strict limits on companies selling stock. France followed suit, requiring any company wanting to sell shares to get approval from a cabinet meeting and the king's signature. Basically, getting a company listed took over 10 years, with super tight regulations, but that wasn't a problem for Joseph. He'd already made the finance minister and the interior minister beneficiaries of Paris Angel Company stock, and the king and queen were on his side too. Plus, Joseph promised at the cabinet meeting that the Paris Angel share price would never be more than 30% higher than the company's real value, and public shares wouldn't be more than 40% of the total. If it dropped too low, the company would step in and buy back shares to prop up the price. Convinced that all financial risks were covered, Louis XVI happily signed off on Paris Angel's listing proposal. Truth was, Joseph still had plenty of wiggle room. What even is a company's real value, anyway? For a store raking in 120,000 livres a day, valuing it at 5 million livres wasn't too far-fetched, right? The entire Paris Angel Company could easily be worth tens of millions of livres. Still, Joseph didn't want to rock the boat too much. A messed-up stock market helped nobody. After all, the Industrial Revolution needed a lot of investment, and a stable stock market was essential for industry to thrive. Besides, if another Mississippi Company fiasco happened, his own downfall might come sooner rather than later. In the square in front of Paris City Hall, a wooden platform about waist-high was already set up. It was decked out with colorful ribbons and garlands, like it was a festival. A banner on top read Paris Angel Stock Offering. Chairs were arranged around the platform, and on the platform were stock traders' counters and staff from various banks to help out. The most eye-catching thing was a giant, smooth wooden board on the left, with transaction record carved at the top. This was where the latest trades would be displayed. The entire trading site took up an area about the size of 2 football fields. Because of John Law's shady dealings, the French public was wary of stock trading. The stock exchange itself was a ghost town, run down and tiny after decades of neglect, so Joseph just set up the trading site outside City Hall at 10 a.m., a lively fanfare of drums and horns filled the air, and people started tossing flower petals. Brent stepped onto the wooden stage and announced in a booming voice, Paris Angel Company is officially offering shares to the public. Everyone is welcome to invest. Right away, an assistant showed the crowd the document signed by the king, authorizing the stock sale. Then, officials from Paris City Hall came up to give speeches congratulating Paris Angel Company on its listing, but the investors couldn't wait any longer and ignored the officials. They mobbed the trading desks, shouting out the number of shares they wanted to buy. Brent almost got trampled. France hadn't seen anything like this in decades. Even when major banks offered stock in the past, people were super cautious and hardly anyone bought in, but Paris Angel had really laid the groundwork this time. It wasn't just the constant ads in the newspapers, but those new stores popping up all over Paris. Everyone could see the hustle and bustle going on. Just yesterday, 3 new Paris Angel stores opened in Paris at the same time, and the streets were packed. Countless ladies, smiling from ear to ear, squeezed out of the stores with bags of purchases. Rumor had it that even more Paris Angel stores were coming to Reims, Marseille, and other cities. They were even planning new stores in Britain. Plus, Paris Angel promised that if the stock price dipped below 80% of the initial price, the company would step in immediately to buy back all the shares. At the same time, the stock price wouldn't be allowed to climb higher than 30% of the company's actual value. Everything pointed to the fact that Paris Angel was no bubble. Zero risk. Seeing how well those stores were doing, and knowing the stock dividends were sure to be high, everyone believed this was a can't-miss opportunity. Buy. Soon, a stock exchange employee wrote the first trade on the wooden sign displaying transaction records. Buy, Paris Angel Company, 2 livres, 30 shares, total 60 livres. Then came the second entry. Buy, Paris Angel Company, 2 livres, 105 shares, total 210 livres. The third entry, the fourth entry, the fifth entry. The Paris Police Department sent over 60 officers to maintain order at the trading site, barely keeping things from spinning out of control. Reporters watched with wide eyes, recording this incredible scene. At 9 p.m., Brent and the Crown Prince's personal accountant rushed excitedly to the Palace of Versailles. In the Crown Prince's reception room, Brent handed Joseph a form issued by the exchange. His hands shaking, the accountant blurted out, barely able to contain his excitement, "Your Highness, a total of 773,000 shares were sold, for a grand total of 1.55 million livres. The truth was, the only reason more shares weren't sold was because everything was done by hand back then, which was super slow. Traders could only fill out and process about 2,000 orders a day, totaling around 700,000 shares. People kept coming to buy stock outside City Hall, crowding the area, but only the lucky few who lined up early in the morning actually managed to make a trade." Joseph praised Brent, then calmly ordered, "Transfer all the funds to the Reserve Bank of France. Follow the plan I laid out before, and don't bother reporting to me again until the funds reach 6 million livres." Chapter 52 The Reserve Bank of France, additional update for Mr. Kai Shuning. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph had just snatched up a small bank teetering on the edge of bankruptcy 2 days before and rebranded it the French Reserve Bank. The whole name change and registration was lightning fast. Connections in the government definitely helped. The bank was ready to roll, storefront and staff all set, and they'd been open for business since yesterday. The next day, the Paris Stock Exchange, responding to Brent's request, added 5 traders to handle the Paris Angel account, a sweet deal for them. Stock transactions sped up immediately. As the market was about to close at 4 p.m., a mystery buyer swooped in and snapped up all 430,000 remaining shares of Paris Angel Company. When the ticker tape flashed, "Buy, Paris Angel Company, 2 livres, 430,150 shares, total 860,300 livres, the trading floor went dead silent. Then, 10 seconds later, the board showed, "For sale, Paris Angel Company, 2 livres 2 sous, 40 shares, total 84 livres. Those 40 shares were gone in a flash. Soon, more offers to sell popped up. In under 10 minutes, the selling price hit 2 livres 5 sous, and they were all snatched up instantly. The next morning, Paris Angel's stock price peaked at 2 livres 8 sous, but demand still outstripped supply, and trading went wild. Over in the corner of the trading floor, a young American, surrounded by 7 or 8 bodyguards, watched the ticker tape. He nodded to his assistant, who walked over to a trader. Put in an order for 8,000 shares, and offered them at 3 livres. Nobody paid much attention. The price was too high, seemed like a tough sell, but less than 3 minutes later, all 8,000 shares were gone in 3 separate trades. Everyone holding stock on the floor suddenly realized something was up. The stock price had to be way higher than it looked, or people wouldn't be grabbing it no matter how high it opened. Suddenly, everyone started holding back, hesitant to sell. After that, the Americans ordered their guys to buy and sell a bunch more times. They'd put up the offer themselves and have others snatch it up, each time at a higher price. After closing, the young American and his crew headed to a fancy hotel nearby, locked the door, piled a ton of cash on the table, and started squaring things up with Joseph's private accountant. Yep, this was the trader Joseph had hired, and the bodyguards were all royal guards. Since countries like Britain and France were cracking down on stock sales, the freewheeling United States had become a haven for stock trading and produced a whole bunch of market whizzes. Thanks to their slick moves, the closing price was close to 3 livres 5 sous. Almost every Paris newspaper was screaming about the Paris Angel's stock price on its front page. Now, not just Paris, but a bunch of nearby provinces had caught wind of it and were rushing to buy stock, and a ton of money flooded the stock exchange. Finally, on the 6th day after Paris Angel's stock sale, when the price hit 4 livres 5 sous, a whole lot of sell orders appeared. But as soon as the stock started dipping, someone would buy big to prop it up. Right after noon, the American trader sold the last 100,000 shares and walked out of the crowded place looking relaxed. Under Joseph's direction, he'd also flipped another 200,000 of Joseph's original shares, buying low and selling high, and raked in a total of 6.15 million livres. Back at the Palace of Versailles, in the finance minister's office, Joseph looked at the loan agreement in front of him with a relaxed grin, a little amused. He was both the finance minister's right-hand man on one side of the agreement and the boss of the French Reserve Bank on the other. He was using his left hand to shake his right. In the end, he signed a loan contract for 6 million livres with himself on behalf of the French government, at a sweet interest rate of just 15%. Payment was no problem. At that moment, more than 8.1 million livres were sitting pretty in the French Reserve Bank's account. Palais Royal, the Duke of Orleans saw the headline in La Presse de Paris on the table: Crown Prince struggling with finances, government debt about to default. He grabbed the newspaper and ripped it to shreds. This was yesterday's paper. He'd heard this morning that the 6 million in national debt had been paid in full, and all the funds had flowed out of the French Reserve Bank. The guys from Mtlnovel and Mtlnovel had just left half an hour ago. To keep them happy, he'd had to promise them more business in the UK. The Duke of Orleans couldn't help but remember that banquet a month ago, when he'd taken the opportunity to get the big French banks to invest in the British automatic textile machine project. He'd asked those 2 banks to block the 6 million livre loan and leaned on the others to play along. He figured that as long as he handled things casually, the Crown Prince would be screwed. After all, the biggest names in French finance were at that table. If they gave the nod, nobody would be able to get a big loan from a bank, but somehow, that kid had pulled it off. A little later, the butler knocked and came in. He bowed to the Duke of Orleans and said, "Sir, we found out. The bank used to be called Cerdo Bank, and His Royal Highness the Crown Prince just acquired it a few days ago. Bank acquisition info was public record, easy to find." The Duke of Orleans frowned. How could this be? How could the Crown Prince create a bank with 6 million livres? How the heck did he do that? Chapter 53: Political Conspiracy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The Duke of Orleans immediately thought of the Paris Angel Company, the store Joseph had founded. He didn't know much about the place, only that he'd once bought a 1,000-livre VIP card for his mistress, after she'd nagged him about it for days. Still, he'd heard that the ladies of Versailles were practically bewitched by the expensive cosmetics sold there. Then he remembered the newspaper articles about the Paris Angel Company selling stock. He narrowed his eyes. 6 million livres, that had to be from the stock sale. A skincare store worth that much? The thing was, Joseph wasn't looking to cash out everything. He still had 1.8 million shares of Paris Angels that he could sell, potentially bringing in another 6 or 7 million. Once Orleans realized this, his anger faded, replaced by a solemn, anxious expression. If the crown prince had been a mere annoyance before, now he was a serious problem, one that needed to be dealt with quickly: public opinion, finance, and the military. The royal family couldn't control those three, or there would be no way to challenge their power over generations. The Orleans family had carefully worked to keep the royal family at arm's length in these areas. For example, in finance, the royal family had become a cash cow for the major banks. Nearly half of the government's revenue went to paying interest on debt, and the debt kept growing. If it continued, the royal family would soon be crushed under a mountain of debt, giving the Orleans family their chance. Historically, that's exactly how things had played out, but the Reserve Bank of France had given the royal family a foothold in the financial world. Eventually, that bank could absorb more and more of the national debt, allowing the crown prince, in control of the bank, to simply write off those debts. Even just a slight boost to the royal family's financial independence would increase public confidence in them. That foothold had to be eliminated. The Duke of Orleans paced the room, then irritably waved to his butler. Donadier, arrange for Earl Isaac, Marquis Laudot, the Earl of Cape Fear, and those guys from the banking association to come hunting at my estate in Yevra tomorrow. Yes, sir. Noon the next day. At the vast estate west of Yevra, sunlight glinted off the withered grass and bare trees. The air filled with the sounds of horses and barking hounds. Dozens of servants directed hundreds of hounds, driving the deer from the bushes and into the open on the south side. The Duke of Orleans, in a dark blue hunting suit, raised his Charleville 1763 short-barreled flintlock. He took aim at a stag in the distance, then pulled the trigger. The shot echoed, smoke filled the air, and the deer took a few steps, lowered its head, and went back to grazing. The Duke of Orleans feigned disappointment and nodded to a middle-aged man with slightly bulging eyes and a hooked nose. Earl Isaac, your turn. The middle-aged man smiled, raised his gun, and fired. The stag collapsed, twitching, right where it had been feeding. Cheers erupted. Hounds and servants raced toward the prey. We've been talking about that bank, Earl Isaac said, handing his gun to a servant and turning to Orleans. He's violating all the accepted industry rules, using his influence to shut down Laborde Bank and Vale Bank. An old man with a nearly invisible neck leaned in. If we don't stop him, everyone's going to suffer. The Duke of Orleans gave him an approving smile. So, I suggest, the old man raised his own gun and aimed at a deer, that the banking association boycott the Reserve Bank of France. Refuse to accept their notes, discourage our clients from doing business with them, that sort of thing. A man in his 50s, wearing a tight, off-white coat and sporting a prominent chin, rode up. I'm afraid that won't be enough to stop him. Isaac turned to the newcomer. What do you suggest, Mr. Necker? Necker bowed respectfully. I believe the Crown Prince is only able to act so recklessly in finance because of the support of the Queen and the Minister of Finance. Otherwise, he never would have gotten permission to sell the Paris Angel Company's stock. The Duke of Orleans nodded thoughtfully. No wonder his Austrian cousin wanted her son to become the assistant to the finance minister. With Brienne in place, she could control all financial policy. The Paris Angel Company and the French Reserve Bank must be part of her plan. He said coldly, you're right. Since Bishop Brienne has chosen to betray us, he's no longer fit to be the Minister of Finance. Brienne was the Speaker of the Assembly of Notables, a representative organization of the great nobility, and the leader in opposing Louis XVI's tax reform bill. Later, to win over the aristocracy, Louis XVI appointed Brienne as finance minister. After taking office, Brienne realized France's finances were in dire straits and that the country could fall into catastrophe. Tax reform was imperative. As a result, he set aside his personal interests and firmly supported the king, for which he was ostracized by the great nobles and the church. Isaac looked around at the group and smiled. If we use our influence to have Brienne removed and replaced with a new finance minister, say, Mr. Necker. Men like Isaac controlled the financial lifeline of France. Combined with Orleans' political power and the strength of the aristocracy, they could definitely influence the choice of finance minister. Necker's eyes gleamed with excitement. He leaned forward. I will make sure the government cuts off cooperation with the Bank of France, and I'll push a bill to revoke Paris Angel's right to sell stocks. That will solve everything at the root. Joseph had no idea that a political conspiracy against him had begun. He was currently presiding over the opening ceremony for the first class of recruits at the newly completed Paris Police Academy. To the steady rhythm of military drums, the academy instructors led their trainees into the auditorium in crisp formation. Attention! Right face, at the command, more than 200 recruits, lined up in neat squares, turned to face their principal, His Royal Highness the Dauphin of France, with eager anticipation. Chapter 54. You are listening at novelfull.audio. On the Police Academy's observation deck, Joseph, decked out in a brand new blue and white Paris police uniform, flashed a warm smile at the instructors and trainees. First off, congratulations. You're about to become the finest police officers France has ever seen. He announced. Yeah, I know, a lot of people look down on or even hate cops. But trust me, that's about to change, starting with you. The police in France will be a respected profession, protecting the people, upholding the law, and cracking down on crime. From now on, you'll be admired, celebrated, and loved by everyone. You'll have women lining up to marry you. With morale sufficiently boosted, Joseph got down to business. I'm thrilled to be your principal. Principal for life. That's me. Remember this, whatever problems you face, whatever hardships you endure, your principal will have your back, always. Even after you graduate and leave the Paris Police Academy, even if you're too old to be a cop anymore, this school will always be the bond between us. The crowd was pumped, feeling like getting into the Paris Police Academy was a gift from God. If they weren't supposed to keep it professional, some would have been shouting, "Long live the principal!" Joseph raised his hand, waving enthusiastically. The Paris Police Academy is officially in session. The instructors and students snapped to attention, hats raised in salute, roaring back, "Yes, sir." Then, Paris Police Chief Besançon stepped forward and announced, His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, will now confer the titles of the new police commissioners of the Paris Police Department. Immediately, a dozen officers in uniform, led by Arden, marched to the center of the auditorium, standing tall and proud in a perfect line. Joseph was impressed. Besançon had orchestrated this ceremony perfectly. Even though the appointments were already set, the ceremony made it clear to everyone, your position comes from the Crown Prince. Don't forget who you're working for. Joseph accepted the copper collar pins and cufflinks, engraved with a sword representing the rank of second-class superintendent, from Besançon and presented them to each of the newly promoted police commissioners. After the investiture, a police academy instructor led the officers through some routine drills for the Crown Prince's benefit. Wrapping up the ceremony, the trainees dispersed, and Joseph joined Dean Friant for a tour of the newly established police academy. Followed by other officers, Besançon deliberately lingered back, winking at a square-faced police commissioner, who hurried over. Besançon frowned, whispering, "Why hasn't that matter been taken care of yet?" "Chief, my guys had it ready 2 days ago," the square-faced officer explained quickly, but then someone from the Daily Affairs team said they had a better approach. "Oh," the square-faced officer relayed the story, and Besançon smiled. "Ah, those guys and their tricks. That's a clever idea." The square-faced officer grinned. "That's what my guys thought too. It'll teach those damn banks a lesson without leaving a trace, so I told them to redo it their way." Besançon nodded approvingly. "Good, get it done ASAP." "Yes, sir." As Joseph toured the police academy buildings and training grounds, he frowned. The school buildings were incredibly basic, clearly renovated from the dilapidated houses of the old slums. The training ground was flat, but that was about it, not much to use for drills or exercises, but, he knew, construction had only started a month ago. "This is my West Point, how can my Paris Police Academy be so run down? Especially now that we've got some cash, we gotta build it to top standards." Joseph pointed at the crumbling school buildings and told Friant, "We need all new buildings over there." They need to hold at least 2,000 people. Each room has to have a fireplace, and the toilets must have flush toilets. Then he looked at the training ground. We need all kinds of training equipment, climbing frames, rope ladders, obstacle courses, sand pits, mud pits. We can't just practice marching formations. Arriving at the police academy's warehouse, Joseph frowned even harder. Why is it full of batons, swords, and spears? Where are the muskets? Friant replied a bit defensively, Your Highness, weren't these what you used to improve public order in St. Anthony district? Joseph sighed. I didn't have a choice back then. But with proper training, muskets will be way more effective. Remember, we need to buy 500 muskets right away. Get the new ones made by Charleville Company. And get plenty of gunpowder and lead bullets. From now on, everyone fires live ammunition 10 times every 3 days. The elite squad fires at least 8 times a day. Friant nodded, surprised. There were only a little over 200 students in the whole academy. 500 guns. And more live fire practice than the Royal Guard's best units. Joseph wasn't done. Buy some warhorses, let's start with 50, and hire a horse trainer. All elite squads have to learn to ride. Talented ones can learn to ride, slash, and charge in formation, that kind of thing. Friant was numb. Fine, whatever. 50 warhorses would cost over 300,000 livres. After seeing the entire police academy, Joseph clicked his tongue and shook his head. The grounds are a little small. Friant started to say that the academy had 2 slopes, which should be enough space for any training, but he heard the Crown Prince mutter, even if we cut back on the gunpowder, we still have to hit the city with 1 shot. This time, everyone who heard him, not just Friant, flinched. Did His Highness expect the police to practice using cannons? Joseph thought for a moment and told Friant, look around Paris for a larger open space to buy. Build some military camps, horse paddocks, and such there. I'll get some cannons later. By the way, anyone here know how to operate a cannon? Friant and the others exchanged glances and shook their heads. Joseph said, good thing Du Bois is an artillery officer, he can teach you. Okay, to start with, that's enough. In Paris, in the Louvre district, at the main branch of Louvel Bank, a group of people in blue and white police uniforms, faces set with scorn, burst through the door carrying batons, shields, and similar gear. A bank teller came over with a forced smile. Officer, what can I do for you? You don't need us, the bank needs us. A fat policeman announced in a gruff voice, we got a tip that a gang of robbers is planning to hit this place today. The customers depositing money or exchanging currency immediately panicked. They stopped what they were doing and bolted out of the bank. The fat policeman winked at his men. Post guards at the door. Check everyone who comes in, don't let any robbers through. Yes, sir, thanks, to the boss for giving this book a generous reward of 5,000 starting coins. The author is extremely grateful and can only add an extra chapter to express his gratitude. I love you, Chapter 55 True and False Fouche, Seeking Publicity and Diffusion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Not to mention having to go through inspection just to get inside, nobody wanted to go anywhere near Louvel Bank with those arrogant cops standing guard. The bank didn't conduct a single transaction all morning, and, surprise, surprise, no robbers showed up either. The bank manager finally lost his patience. He approached the fat cop, forcing a smile, and said, Officer, I think the robbers might have given up. The fat cop glared at him. How would you know the robbers gave up? You in contact with them or something? No, absolutely not. The manager stammered, his face contorting. But if you stay here, the robbers won't dare to come, but the customers are scared off too. Not my problem. If I wasn't here and you got robbed, my paycheck would suffer. The manager understood what was going on. He turned around, grabbed a bag of silver coins, and quietly pressed it into the fat cop's hand, whispering, I can compensate you for the lost salary. The fat cop beamed. He'd been stuck digging in the river since getting transferred to the daily affairs team, and he didn't even have a police uniform. Now, the police commissioner had personally assigned him a task, issued him a uniform and equipment, and said he could make a little extra cash on the side, so of course he wasn't going to be polite with the bank manager. After pocketing the money, he stood his ground. The manager was desperate. "I've paid you for your trouble, just go back and relax." "Can't do that," the fat cop said, putting on a serious face. "You're taking such good care of me. I can't let any robbers hurt you." That the manager had no choice but to send someone to notify General Manager Etienne. Etienne tried bribing the cop again, but it didn't work. He had to keep reporting to the board. Meanwhile, the same thing was happening at Laborde Bank. A bunch of police officers were protecting the bank so well, not even a fly could get in. The next day, the police claimed they'd gotten a tip that the robbers might dig a tunnel to steal the vault, so they hired a crew to dig a hole more than 13 feet deep around the bank to find this tunnel. Of course, no tunnel was ever found, and the bank got stuck with the bill for the construction. For 3 days straight, neither bank saw a single customer. The bank executives marched to Police Chief Besançon to complain, but all they got was, "For your safety, please cooperate." Around noon, a reporter showed up at Louvel Bank for an interview. Before he could even open his mouth, the fat cop pulled him aside and started talking in a conspiratorial whisper. Apparently, during the Saint-Antoine district gang sweep, they'd found secret messages about contacting foreign gangs. The Ottoman gang had infiltrated Paris and was threatening to not only rob the bank, but kill everyone inside. The reporter couldn't believe his luck. He immediately slipped the fat cop a few silver coins and ran back to the press to write up the scoop. Soon, everyone in Paris was talking about the Ottoman gang. Citizens steered clear of the two banks like they were plague zones, not daring to get within 100 feet, afraid of getting caught in the crossfire if the gangsters attacked. Joseph had no idea Besançon had ordered someone to teach the bank a lesson. When he left the Paris Police Academy and returned to the Palace of Versailles, a short, middle-aged man in a worn grey coat, with thinning hair and an honest face, was already waiting for him. It took Joseph a few seconds to remember his name. He smiled and said, "Captain Prosper, what brings you here? Any news on that matter?" This unremarkable man was one of the 3 top spies the Minister of War had promised to assign to Joseph. He'd arrived in Paris just 2 days earlier. Given the communication and transportation limitations of the time, he was the first to arrive. Half the spies deployed by the Secretary of War were still on the road. Prosper bowed respectfully and said in a hoarse voice, "Your Highness, I've found the person you're looking for." That was fast. Joseph was a little surprised. In those days, there wasn't even a complete household registry, let alone a database of city residents. And yet, this guy had located the person in just 2 days, using only his name and a few characteristics. He truly was an ace spy that even Saint Priest couldn't bear to lose. "It's nothing, Your Highness. If I knew Paris better, 1 day would be enough." The spy frowned, then continued, "It's just that there's a slight complication." "Oh. What's that?" Prosper said, "There are 2 people named Joseph Fuchet who fit the description you gave." Yes, the person Joseph had asked him to find was none other than Fuchet, who later became the Emperor's chief intelligence officer, played a major role in the coup of Brumaire, and later switched his allegiance to Louis XVIII, becoming known as the Executioner of Lyon. Originally, Joseph had planned to select one of Prosper's spies to head up his future intelligence agency. But after interacting with them, Joseph realized that while these people were excellent at espionage, they weren't as good at management, big-picture planning, and personnel deployment. Therefore, he needed to find a general manager for the intelligence agency to ensure its smooth operation. He immediately thought of the notorious Fuchet, a ruthless man who could build an intelligence empire for the emperor. Although this man had a successful career and was a major player in French politics. Later in life, due to his humble beginnings, he was still just a little priest that nobody cared about. So Joseph had asked the spies to find him, also wanting to test their abilities. He hadn't expected them to find them so quickly. Now, he just needed to figure out which one was the Fuchet he wanted. He glanced at the sky and said to Prosper, "Please take me to meet them tomorrow." Yes, your highness. The next day, in a small monastery in the north district of Paris, Prosper and his men, dressed in plain clothes, found Fuchet and took him to a remote cabin. Prosper looked at the nervous monk and said in a deep voice, "I'm with the royal police. Listen, there are several foreign spies in your monastery. Right now, I can only confirm that you have nothing to do with this matter. And these guys stole an important piece of information. If they were alerted, the information could be destroyed." The monk's eyes widened. "Why are you telling me this?" Prosper handed him a paper bag. "I need you to poison their food so they all die at the same time." The monk turned pale, and the poison fell from his hand like a scorpion. He trembled. "No, there are innocent people among them. I can't kill them." Joseph shook his head slightly from outside the room. "That's not him. Let's go." Iman entered the house, told the monk it was just a joke, and left him 10 livres before leaving with Joseph and the others. An hour later, in another larger monastery, Prosper used the same approach. He turned to the monk with sunken cheeks, bulging eyes, and thin lips, and said, "So, I need you to put poison in their meal." Suddenly, a light appeared in the monk's eyes. "Sir, if I help the secret police, will I be rewarded?" "That because this book is being recommended for new books, it is very important for young authors. I urge readers to save it, vote for recommendations, monthly votes, and leave messages. The young author is grateful, your support is the motivation for me to code." Reader Group 103-621-7580, everyone is welcome to join the group and chat and discuss together. Chapter 56, Fuchet has been wandering for half his life, and has never met his master. If he never You are listening at novelfull.audio. Abandons him, Prosper nodded. This mission's crucial, so the reward will be substantial. The monk suddenly looked down. Prosper was about to speak when he snapped his head up, leaning in with a hint of excitement. "My lord, I've thought it through. Directly poisoning the food is risky. What if someone's late for dinner? But, could you give me some funds?" "Sure. How much do you need?" 20 livres. The monk intertwined his fingers, as if grasping at something. "I'll make up an excuse, my birthday, maybe. No one remembers it anyway. I'll throw a small party, buy some good wine, poison the food and wine beforehand. That way, everyone eats it at the same time. Plus, I can invite you, say you're a relative. If anyone isn't hit hard enough by the poison and tries to destroy the information before they die, you can take them out immediately." Joseph shook his head, then nodded and pushed open the door. "That's him. That's the Fuchet I've been looking for." Iman followed him inside, explaining to the surprised Fuchet that it was all just a joke and there wasn't a foreign spy. Joseph sat down opposite the monk, studying his face. "Mr. Fuchet, you seem a little disappointed." No. Joseph cut to the chase. "If you needed to set up an intelligence department ASAP, what would you do?" Fuchet raised his eyes, glanced at the young man, then quickly looked down and rubbed his hands. "Excuse me, what's my budget?" Joseph paused. 500,000 livres. More if necessary. An unnamable fire flickered in Fuchet's eyes, and he nodded. 500,000, then the quickest way is to recruit former secret police. "Oh, I mean the royal police. Are there many of them?" "Yes," Fuchet said immediately. "Back when the old king was in charge, the royal police force was huge. They were all over Paris. Maybe to cut costs, His Majesty laid off more than half of them. Those guys are experienced. They can hit the ground running." Joseph frowned slightly. "Wouldn't the royal police who got laid off be the least capable?" Fuchet smiled. "You might not know how they decided who stayed and who went. It all came down to connections and bribes. Actually, the fired ones are the ones who can really work. They spent their time gathering intel, not sucking up to their superiors. Besides them, I can also recruit people from universities, even military academies. They're smart and they've been around the upper class. With a little training, they'll be great spies. And then there's the post office. Joseph nodded to himself. Fuchet was definitely gifted in intelligence, and the emperor had a sharp eye. He was curious. You're a monk. How do you know so much about the royal police, universities, and the post office? See more, hear more, think more. Fuchet glanced at Joseph again. I have to know stuff. I have to know about royal police, nobles, churches, schools, rich people, poor people, even thieves. I won't be in this monastery forever. That kind of knowledge will come in handy sooner or later. Very good, Joseph nodded. Final question, are you willing to work for me and head up an intelligence agency? Fuchet's pupils widened and he rubbed his hands nervously. If I had to guess, you'd be His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, right? Joseph nodded. A future intelligence chief who couldn't figure that out would be strange. Fuchet immediately stood up and saluted eagerly. Your Highness, I would be honored to be your most loyal servant. Joseph nodded, but inwardly chuckled at the loyal servant bit. Fuchet was like a vulture. If he saw meat, he'd swoop down and grab a bite without hesitation. His abilities were incredible, but loyalty wasn't exactly his strong suit. Historically, he'd sold the National Assembly to the Jacobins, sold out the Jacobins, sold the Emperor, then sold Louis XVIII and the Restoration Emperor. Joseph was willing to use him now because he was sure nobody else could offer a better deal. So he'd be loyal, for now. Besides, he needed Fuchet's expertise to build the intelligence agency's foundation. Once it was up and running, he could replace him if he had to. Villains sometimes have their uses. Then let's head straight to your new office, Joseph said, standing up. Fuchet hesitated, then asked cautiously. Your Highness, that 500,000 you mentioned, was that for real? As long as you impress me with your abilities, several more 500,000s are entirely possible. Joseph knew intelligence work was expensive by nature. He wasn't afraid of a little corruption from Fuchet. A little corruption was actually easier to control, and he planned to set up another department down the line to focus on rooting out official corruption. The group left the monastery and took a carriage to a large villa in the western suburbs of Paris. Joseph had bought the place more than 10 days ago. Because it wasn't in downtown Paris, the price wasn't too high, and it was fairly close to the Palace of Versailles. This would be the intelligence agency's office from now on. In the hall on the first floor, a huge conference table had already been set up. Fuchet, Prosper, and the other 7 spies who had arrived in Paris were all sitting at the table. Joseph looked around at everyone. For now, this intelligence agency will be under the police station, and be called the Police Bureau Intelligence Division. However, it won't be under the police station's jurisdiction, it'll report directly to me. He turned to Fuchet. Fuchet will serve as the head of the intelligence department of the police station, for now. Yes, Your Highness. Thank you for your trust. Fuchet, still wearing his priest's robe, stood and saluted, looking a little out of place. Frankly, he still couldn't figure out why the Crown Prince was entrusting him with so much responsibility so quickly. It felt like a dream. Yesterday, he'd been praying for success. Today, the Crown Prince had come knocking. Suddenly, a possibility occurred to him. His Royal Highness must have been observing me for a long time, in some way I didn't realize. That thought made him feel a lot calmer. He hoped this son of God's favorite really did have magic power. Joseph continued, Captain Prosper, you'll be the commander of the action team. You'll be responsible for specific operations. Yes, Your Highness. Captain Quinton, Joseph said to another senior spy, you'll be responsible for training intelligence personnel. From now on, you'll go to the Paris Police Academy at least 2 days a week to teach intelligence courses. You can also pick qualified personnel from the academy. Talented students can be directly absorbed into the police intelligence department. Yes, Your Highness. As for the duties of everyone else, including those who haven't arrived in Paris yet. Joseph gestured to Fuchet. That's all up to the supervisor. Thanks to Two-Legged Sheep Game, Forgot to Worry and Fearless, HP_Lovecraft, and book friends 202301232329418862, these four great guys, gave rewards to this book. Tianhaitian is so grateful. Chapter 57 Mrs. Sanbellan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Joseph wasn't about to micromanage the creation of the police intelligence department. He was a complete novice in that area and planned to leave the nitty-gritty to the experts. His job was simply to steer the ship. The entire police intelligence department watched the Crown Prince leave, buzzing with anticipation. Frankly, Prospel and the others weren't thrilled when they found out the police intelligence department was technically under the police umbrella, even if only on paper. They'd initially hoped for a transfer to the Royal Guard. However, the promise of a fat paycheck, enough to soothe any bruised egos, quickly replaced their discontent with a surge of enthusiasm. The Duke of Orleans returned to the Palais Royal, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. Right as he was plotting Brian's downfall, news arrived from the High Court that Brian's latest tax bill, which completely ignored the nobility's concerns, had been summarily rejected. Talk about divine intervention. This was the perfect opening to take Brian down. He'd orchestrated everything he needed at the cocktail party. First, he'd secured the support of key nobles. They would spread the word that Brian was a threat to their interests, an enemy of the entire aristocracy, and that they must fight his policies tooth and nail. Then, he'd formed an alliance with the Minister of Justice and the Foreign Minister, who would join him at the next cabinet meeting to propose a vote of no confidence, citing Brian's incompetence and failure to make progress on the tax issue. Simultaneously, the entire financial sector would pile on, spreading rumors that Brian didn't understand economics and that only the brilliant banker Necker could save France's economy. The banks would rally behind Necker and fully cooperate to improve the economy. Under this multi-pronged attack, the Queen would have no choice but to sacrifice Brian to stabilize the political situation. And once Necker was in power, everything would be back under his control. The Duke of Orleans strolled down the east corridor towards his study, but stopped short when he heard strange noises coming from his son's music room. He frowned, glancing at the guard standing a safe distance away. The guard immediately lowered his head, whispering, I didn't see anything. The Duke of Orleans called out to the music room, Philippe, is that you in there? That there was a commotion inside. A moment later, the door swung open. A plump woman in her late 30s, the Duke of Orleans' son's piano teacher, scurried out, looking flustered. Her face was flushed, her hair was a mess, and her dress was crooked, as if she'd thrown it on in a hurry. She curtsied awkwardly to the Duke of Orleans and hurried away, hugging the wall. The Duke of Orleans entered the room, his face darkening. He saw that his son's shirt was buttoned wrong. He pointed a finger at him and snapped, how many times have I told you? Don't mess around with commoners. You could have your pick of noble ladies, they'd be thrilled to be with you. Little Philippe avoided his father's gaze but retorted, those little girls can't hold a candle to Madame Hollet's charm. You. Little Philippe shrank back, quickly turning and fleeing the music room. The Duke of Orleans was about to explode, but then he remembered his own escapades with the maids when he was his son's age. He sighed, feeling a wave of understanding. What boy could resist the allure of a mature woman? Speaking of maturity and charm, the figure of Madame Sanbellan at the reception flashed into his mind, a bewitching, captivating beauty. Every pore oozed an irresistible temptation. Countless noblemen were enthralled by her. She had at least half a dozen lovers. If a boy Philippe's age saw her, he probably wouldn't be able to think about anything else. He suddenly smirked. The little tease had no idea that one of her lovers, the Earl of Cape Fear, had contracted syphilis. The Earl of Cape Fear, during the hunt the day before yesterday, had been bragging about his affair with Madame Sanbellan, only to be diagnosed with syphilis that very day. In other words, in a few years, that woman would be covered in sores, reeking of death, and avoided by everyone. While syphilis was sometimes used by nobles to flaunt their romantic conquests, everyone knew it was a horrific terminal disease. The Duke of Orleans knew that Louis XV had actually died from it. if only her entire family would die from that revolting disease. He cursed silently, then froze, a thought striking him. That's it. Let them all get infected. His eyes lit up with glee. That boy won't be able to resist Madame Sanbellan, and she'll pass it on to him. Yes, perfect, that he thought it through carefully, convinced that the plan had a high chance of success, and even if it failed, he'd lose nothing. He immediately summoned his butler, eager to give him some discreet instructions. Yes, sir. A few hours later, at Madame Sanbellan's house, Viscount Valles exclaimed, "This guy said you'll get 15,000 livres if you can seduce the crown prince." Madame Sanbellan wrapped her arms around his neck and said with a seductive look, "That's a lot of cash. Which big shot is so generous? What's he up to?" Viscount Valles naturally wouldn't dare reveal the Duke of Orleans' name. He simply waved his hand, saying, "Don't worry about who it is. He wants to get in good with the crown prince, so he needs some inside information. You just need to hook up with the crown prince and report some of his movements. If you do that, you get extra." Madame Sanbellan was clearly intrigued. Seducing a 13-year-old boy was child's play for a seasoned flirt like her, and there might even be a reward from the crown prince himself. The French court was so chaotic that it wasn't uncommon for someone to sleep with the king, and nobody cared if others knew about it. She suddenly regretted not thinking of this sooner. She smiled coquettishly, nuzzling Viscount Valles' face with the tip of her nose, and purred, "Don't you mind pushing me into another man's arms?" He pressed her onto the velvet mattress, leaning down to kiss her. "It's not like I can't still come to you, so what are you worried about?" "Oh, you." The next day, in Queen Mary's concert hall, a group of ladies surrounded the Queen, chattering about the latest gossip to the soothing background music. The Queen's maid, Count de Benignac, suddenly said, "Next week is St. Nicholas' Day, so we should have the usual masquerade ball, right?" Madame Sanbellan, standing on the edge of the group, perked up at the mention of the masquerade ball. The crown prince would definitely be there. This was her chance. Her mind raced through countless seduction techniques, and she immediately smiled and said loudly, "Everyone must be tired of the same masquerade party every year. I have a brilliant idea for this year, thanks to Mr. Wang for the generous donation." Chapter 58 Sarabande Dance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The ladies immediately looked to Madame Sanbellan, and when she explained her idea for the ball, they erupted in laughter. "I think it's a great idea," Count de Benignac chimed in. Queen Mary smiled and nodded. "Very interesting. Let's do it this year. This year's masquerade will be a blast." Everyone agreed. "Mrs. Sanbellan is so clever. I'm going to dance all night long." From that day forward, a new face appeared at the palace. It was Madame Sanbellan, enchanting, charming, and catching the eye of every man. The palace of Versailles had a long-standing tradition where noble families served the royals. For example, when the queen woke up each morning, the wives of princes and dukes would often help her dress. Though Mrs. Sanbellan wasn't of the highest status, she was still eligible to perform some chores at the palace. After giving a few small gifts to the prince's maids, she could be found everywhere, except where specific personnel were required. Madame Sanbellan was very strategic. She would often appear in the prince's peripheral vision with a vase or tablecloth, ensuring other maids called out her name, all without directly attracting his attention. Joseph had no clue this extra maid was around. There were just too many maids at Versailles, but after a few days, she started to look familiar. The week flew by, and soon it was St. Nicholas' Day. Joseph reluctantly left his study after being repeatedly urged by the maids. The Queen's maid, Count de Benignac, arrived personally with a long black dress, calling for the maids to assist. Joseph's face was as dark as the dress. If Count de Benignac, the head honcho of the harem, hadn't been personally supervising, he might have escaped the palace altogether. The maids hastily removed his coat and trousers. Count de Benignac gently placed the black dress over his head, helped him put his hands through the sleeves, and tightened the back. "Easy, easy. I'm suffocating." Joseph cried out, feeling constricted. "The dance is about to start. Please cooperate, Your Highness." Count de Bonnenac placed a translucent silk shawl over him, carefully positioned a towering wig with feathers on his head, and then gave a nod. Perfect fit. Joseph glanced at the dress and wanted to punch whoever came up with this idea. He was a straight man in his past life, and now he was forced to dress as a woman in the 18th century. Yes, the theme of the masquerade was gender swap. Men dressed as women and acted like ladies, while women wore men's clothes and acted like gentlemen. Joseph glanced in the mirror. It was a disaster. The French are nuts, he muttered to himself. In truth, the private dances of some nobles were far wilder than this. Tonight's masquerade was relatively tame. Fortunately, Count de Bonnenac wasn't forcing him to wear heels, which weren't just for ladies anyway. When Joseph, wearing a mask, zombie walked into the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, cheerful music filled the air. The 24 massive Bohemian crystal chandeliers shone brightly, and hundreds of noble men and women turned to look at him. The king and queen had arrived. Queen Mary, dressed as a red swordsman with a small mustache, looked at Joseph and said sternly, "Young lady, you're late." Louis XVI, in a dark blue dress, hid his face behind a matching silk fan and smiled and nodded at his son. The Chancellor of the Seal, dressed as a shepherdess, stepped to the center of the hall, offered a series of festive greetings, and announced the start of the dance. Masked men and women began to dance. Almost immediately, 7 or 8 aristocratic ladies in various men's outfits rushed towards Joseph, bowed, and extended their hands. "May I have this dance, my dear lady?" "Madam, are you willing to dance with the police?" The girl who spoke was wearing the latest Paris police uniform. "Miss, you know I asked first." "Beautiful lady, dance with me." Although Joseph wore a mask, these women clearly recognized him. According to court etiquette, high-status individuals could invite those of lower status to dance, but not the other way around. Also, men usually invited women. But tonight, with the gender swap theme, these girls seized the chance and swarmed the prince. Finally, a strong coachman shoved the others aside, grabbed Joseph's hand, dragged him to the center of the dance floor, and coughed loudly. Ahem. Clearly, she had already arranged this with everyone, as the nobles around them stopped dancing and gathered around her and Joseph. The coachman asked softly, "What dance would you like to do, miss?" Joseph wanted to disappear. Seeing the expectant faces, he reluctantly said, "Sarabande." "As you wish." The coachman signaled the musicians, and box music began. Joseph was dragged onto the floor. He had only been learning court dancing for a month and looked incredibly awkward. The musicians stared at the prince's feet, trying desperately to match the music to his steps, which was nearly impossible. If they knew the term Brownian motion, they would have used it to describe his dancing. Soon, Joseph stepped on the coachman's feet 3 times and elbowed her once. The girl in the police uniform saw her chance during the coachman's shoulder rub and grabbed Joseph. "Beautiful lady, what dance would you like?" "Sarabande." Joseph was stuck with this dance. The music started, the dance began, and soon the police gave up. Then the cavalry came forward. "What kind of dance do you want?" Joseph sighed. "Sarabande." He danced the sarabande for nearly an hour. Though his poor dancing was torturous, the aristocratic ladies fought valiantly for first place. In the corner, Mrs. Sanbellan, disguised as a scholar, watched the swarm of girls around the prince, angrily crumpling the Descartes geometry in her hand. This dance was her idea, meant to create a chance for her to flirt with the prince, but now she couldn't even get close to him. Those noble ladies were too aggressive. She threw the book aside and smiled disdainfully. "Ha! You think you can compete with me?" She asked a servant for paper and a pen, thought for a moment, quickly wrote a note, handed it to Viscount Valles, and pointed to Joseph. Finally, after Joseph changed his 10th partner, Perna, who had been silently observing him, saw his distress and couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward and offered to dance a woodcutter's dance. "His Highness's pneumonia hasn't fully recovered. It's not wise to overexert himself." "Ah. She's right." Joseph heard the voice of an angel. Perna was like a savior. He nodded gratefully and squeezed out of the crowd, fleeing for his life. Chapter 59. I Want to Duel with You. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Perna watched the crown princes retreating back, worried the dance had soured his mood. She hesitated, wanting to follow, then she remembered her duty to watch over his health. She pursed her lips, pushed past the glaring noblewomen, and hurried after Joseph. Joseph tightened his mask, ripped off the bothersome shawl, and slipped through the crowd. He took a deep breath, wiping his brow. Before the social butterflies could catch him, he practically sprinted to the Hall of Mirrors exit and escaped. The night air in Versailles Square was cool and refreshing. He stretched his arms, strolling slowly, feeling much better. He vowed to himself he'd never attend another one of those dances. In the courtyard's dim lamplight, Iman, disguised as a maid, spotted the crown prince's figure and rushed over. "Your Highness, why are you out here so fast?" A light figure in a white robe arrived almost simultaneously from the opposite direction. "Your Highness." Iman turned, surprised. "Miss Perna, what are you?" He glanced between them, suddenly catching on, and coughed awkwardly. "Ahem, Your Highness, I have an errand to run. I'll be going now." "Wait," Perna said, anxiously blushing. "I just came to ask if you were feeling unwell." Joseph quickly replied, "I'm fine. I just needed some air. Dancing is truly awful." Iman realized he'd jumped to conclusions and nodded sheepishly. "Ah, right. Those ladies are a little enthusiastic." As the three stood there uncomfortably, they saw two figures approaching, a girl seemingly sobbing. "No, André, you don't understand. I'd trade everything for the time I spend with you." The man's voice said, "Oh, Emily, please, marry me. Fate has reunited us, and I won't lose you again." "But you know it's impossible." The girl choked back tears. "My heart tells me to give you all my love, but my reason tells me the entire Villars family rests on my shoulders. I must let go of my love for you and marry another man. My dearest Emily, I wish I could plug my ears so I wouldn't hear your cruel words, and gouge out my eyes so I wouldn't see your tears. Do you know you're in my dreams every night? I love you, and you love me. Isn't that enough? Do we need to drag an innocent into our messed up destiny and our pain?" The girl wept silently. This seemed like a private moment. Joseph started to slip away, but found himself backed up against a row of meticulously trimmed hedges, the couple blocking the path ahead. He looked helplessly at Iman, who scanned the area and pulled him behind a maple tree. Perna followed close behind. The tree wasn't big enough. Iman's back pressed against the trunk, squeezing Joseph and Perna together, barely concealing them. Luckily, the moonlight was dim, making it hard to spot anyone hiding there unless you looked closely. The girl's voice, still choked with tears, drifted closer. "André, not all love can see the light of day. You know, my mother cares too much about appearances and the title of duke." The man held her tightly. "Emily, I just distinguished myself on the battlefield and was promoted to lieutenant. Please believe me, in a few years, I'll have a position worthy of you." The girl embraced him, shaking her head in anguish. "But my cousin keeps pushing me to marry his son, and I can't hold out much longer." "No. You can't marry him," the man pleaded. "Your mother won't allow it, will she?" The girl sighed. "Did you know? My mother was the one who suggested my cousin transfer you to Soissons, just to make me forget you." "André? Soissons?" Joseph frowned, recognizing the voice. "Is that Lieutenant Davout?" Iman peeked out from behind the tree at the girl wearing a crusader uniform in the dim gaslight, guessing, "She looks like the Duke of Villars." "Duke?" Perna whispered in surprise. "That girl is a duke," Iman nodded, lowering his voice. "You know Marshal Villars? He defeated the British twice at Steenkerk and Neerwinden. Later, he defeated Prince Eugene at Freiburg. This Miss Marie Emily is the great-granddaughter of Marshal Villars, and now the Duke of Villars. However, her father was punished for delaying an attack during the 7 Years' War, weakening the family, though the Villars still have significant clout in the army, especially around Moulins." Perna nodded. She knew of the famous marshals from the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV. Iman continued, I hear the family's holdings are managed by Major General Villers, Miss Emily's cousin. Joseph sneered, sounds like he's trying to force her to marry his son to seize control of the entire family fortune. Pernod was furious. Shameless. Absolutely shameless. At that moment, a tall, thin man dressed as a flower girl hurried over. Spotting Emily, he called out, My dear Emily, why are you here? Come back. The dance isn't over yet. Emily replied coldly, It's none of your concern where I am. Please leave. But the flower girl reached out to pull her. I'm your fiancé. I can't just ignore you. No. You're not my fiancé. I never agreed to marry you. The flower girl smiled slyly. It's just a matter of time. Your mother will agree to the marriage. If it weren't for the 30,000 livres my father gave her, your family wouldn't even be able to maintain appearances. Behind the tree, Perna asked doubtfully, 30,000 livres is a lot, but would the Duke of Villers' mother marry her daughter to someone she dislikes just for the money? Iman whispered, I heard that Major General Villers controls everything. Joseph added, It's all part of the scheme. By marrying his son to Miss Emily, everything the Duke of Villers owns will fall into his family's hands. Pernod was furious. Shameless. Absolutely shameless. The flower girl glanced at André and said with a sneer, Oh, if it isn't the little officer from Soissons. What are you doing at the ball, still chasing my Emily? André, invited to the ball for his service, glared at the man. I love Emily, and she loves me. I won't let her marry you. The flower girl laughed, a nobody like you wants to marry the Duke of Villers? Do you know what the Duke of Villers' estate costs to maintain? Your measly salary wouldn't even cover 2 days. André started to say, but he was angry. The flower girl continued, even if Emily married you, the Duke of Villers' family would be a laughingstock, and her mother would be humiliated. Imagine the whispers, Oh, Mrs. Verrill, your daughter married a poor lieutenant with no title? How unfortunate. You. André's face was red. He threw his gloves on the ground, then pulled out his sword. I, Louis André de Devaux, challenge you to a duel. Chapter 60 I have a friend who can do divination, please vote for me. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The flower girl on the other side smirked and drew her sword, I'm Honoré Roche de Villers, and I'm about to teach you a lesson you won't forget. Almost every member of the Villers family has a military background, and Louis XVI was no exception. He was a major in the Bourges regiment, a real tough guy. No. Emily cried out, Stop, but the 2 young men were locked in, each looking for a chance to draw blood. André attacked first, aiming a lightning-fast thrust at his opponent's ribs. Louis XVI slammed his sword down, the tip digging into the ground, then stabbed upwards at André's calf. André had seen his share of combat and knew how to react under pressure. He leaped back, simultaneously slashing upward with his sword. Louis XVI barely dodged, clearly surprised by the officer's swordsmanship. He perked up and picked up the pace. In the courtyard garden, the lady in red and the flower girl weaved through the shadows, locked in a fierce duel. Joseph, peeking from behind a tree, could see that André had the upper hand, but the light was fading. If someone wasn't careful, his mind raced. First, the future Marshal Davout's brother couldn't die here. Second, Emily and her family were being bullied, their fortune at risk. Since she was André's sweetheart, it was his duty to help the young couple, and if Emily married André, her influence could help reclaim the Duke Villers' power. The Villers family carried considerable weight in Milan's army, which could be a huge asset down the road. Stop it. André, watch out. Emily screamed, then ran toward the fighting, reaching out to stop them. Both men startled and quickly sheathed their swords, but Louis XVI was too slow. The tip of his blade grazed the girl's arm. Ah! Emily cried, seeing a finger-wide gash on her arm. Louis XVI froze for a moment, then feigned concern, reaching for her chest as he spoke, Oh, Emily, darling. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, but André was terrified, grabbing his sweetheart's hand, unable to speak clearly. How bad is it? Are you hurt badly? Why did you run out there? Seeing this, Joseph stepped out from behind the tree. Iman immediately stood in front of him and addressed the swordsman, please, put away your weapons. Perna quickly opened her small case, took out her tools, and stepped forward to treat Emily's wound. She breathed a sigh of relief when she saw it wasn't too serious. Seeing an outsider appear and Emily hurt, Louis XVI knew the fight was over. He wiped his brow, sheathed his sword, and tried to pull Emily away. Sheesh, he got lucky. Emily, let's go back to dancing. Joseph said coldly, Sir, why do you want Mr. Davout's fiancée? What did you say? Davout's? Ha! Louis XVI didn't recognize the crown prince in women's clothing and laughed sarcastically. I don't know who you are, but he'll never be good enough for the Villars. Really? Joseph smiled. Let's make a bet. Louis XVI stopped. Oh. What are we betting on? If Mr. Davout and the Duke of Villars are engaged tomorrow, you publicly kiss his boots, Joseph said. If they aren't engaged, then Mr. Davout kisses yours. No way. André gasped, trying to stop him, but the young man winked. Joseph pointed to Imang, Mr. Davout, trust my friend. He's a fortune teller. He just predicted you'll be engaged to this lady tomorrow. Imang's jaw dropped. André felt a familiar ring in Joseph's voice, and suddenly blurted out, it's the king. Joseph coughed loudly, cutting him off. Ahem. What do you two say? Are we on? André had no confidence, but since the crown prince was pushing it, he gritted his teeth and nodded, I agree. Louis XVI sneered, fine, I'm in. Great, give me a high five. Joseph prompted, everyone here is a witness. Let's keep it fair. Louis XVI, not taking it seriously, slapped Dao's hand casually and walked off. André wanted to ask the crown prince his plan, but Joseph said, I wouldn't dream of interrupting quality time for lovebirds. See you tomorrow. He had no choice but to suppress his questions and watch the three leave. Emily, remembering something, waved to Perna's back, thank you for treating my wound. Would you mind telling me your name? When she didn't get an answer, she sighed softly, turned, and hugged André tightly, fearing this might be their last time together. After walking a while, Perna asked Joseph curiously, Your Highness, how will you get Miss Emily and Mr. Davout engaged? Joseph smiled slightly, I'll convince Miss Emily's mother. Convince? Joseph nodded toward the Hall of Mirrors. Let's go. Let's find her now. When they returned to the Hall of Mirrors, the dance was reaching its peak, everyone moving elegantly to the music. Joseph, wary of being cornered, stayed in the shadows, asking Emin to find Emily's mother. As soon as Imang left, a young man in a sequin dress approached, sized Joseph up, slipped a note into his hand, and pointed toward the second-floor balcony, pretending to be a scholar's lady. She asked me to give you this. Joseph glanced at the voluptuous woman, confused, opened the note, and read a single line, I know your biggest secret. Want to keep it? Meet me in room 2 at the east end of the South Hall. The note was from Madame Sanbellan, who knew how to hook a man. She knew that directly stating I admire you or I want to spend the night with you like those flighty girls or bohemian women didn't get you far. She knew no one could resist a secret, especially the secret of how others knew their secret. She smiled, triumphant. She was sure that once that 13-year-old boy stepped into her room, he wouldn't want to leave. Joseph frowned. His biggest secret? That he was from another world, of course. Could this woman be a time traveler too? Thinking this, he immediately left the Hall of Mirrors, heading for the South Hall. Across the Hall of Mirrors, a young man dressed as a fairy narrowed his eyes as he watched Joseph leave. The crown prince had deserted hundreds of noble ladies twice tonight. What was he up to? He pondered, then followed, thanks to the big boss Wenhua for his generous reward for this book. The young author is very grateful and can only repay it by coding the book seriously.